This episode deals with racism and sexism with brief mentions of trauma, grief, and suicidal ideation. Please feel free to listen to our other episodes and take care.
So if Elena was your main character and her entire life force is tethered to this other character who is powerful, who's dynamic, the fans love her already. Why not give the space?
You're listening to Mystic Mondays, a supernatural-themed podcast hosted by fangirls Mika and Becca, who examine the best and the worst of beloved supernatural stories found in TV and film. Grab your steaks and your garlic because we're about to dive into Vampire Town. Again. Bonnie Bennett is one of the most underappreciated and disrespected characters in the Vampire Diaries by both characters and writers alike. So we're here today to talk about that and also how fanfiction has taken steps to give her the love that she deserves.
Huge topic, very broad, which is why we're going to focus it on our girl Bonnie.
Yes.
If you haven't listened to our first episode, I suggest that you do so that you get a broader understanding of what our feelings towards the Vampire Diaries and its treatment of trauma and, I guess, serious topics. I feel like we've decided that they didn't do so hot with how they handled many characters.
Yeah.
But especially Bonnie. Neither of us really can speak to the experience of Bonnie because she's a Black woman and she's a Black witch. But we both really feel for her character's struggles and the lack of good direction that she was given throughout the course of the show. So here we are talking about how and why fanfiction did it better.
When these shows have a good character, or when an actor brings something to a character that connects with an audience or resonates with an audience, but the writing always lets them down, which happens more often than you would want it to happen, fanfiction tends to be a place where you can kind of fix it, or at least give the character a meaningful story outside of their canon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Bonnie's a great example of that because every step of the way in the Vampire Diaries, I can't really think of a time in that show where she was really given the kind of attention that other characters are given in the same way.
Right.
I feel like especially early on, she's always second to Elena in every way. So no matter what she's going through, even if she's mad at Elena, she will always step up for her or sacrifice herself for Elena's plot. She's always separating herself from her own desires and growth and wants because that's just where the story has to take her since she's the witch.
Yeah. There are many videos that cover just how deep the injustice goes for her.
Yeah.
The thing is, even from that base level of the treatment of her actress, of Kat Graham, she's a very talented actress. I would say that she's probably one of the more talented actors on the show.
I would agree. She really gives her all in everything, even early on.
Yeah, both from like the way that she delivers her lines, and when she's like super upset, it's really palpable. When she is doing something like, I don't know, reciting a spell, she's very convincing. And she's also talented in the sense that she can sing, she can dance. She's got all of this in her toolkit, so to speak, as an artist. It's always interesting to me to look back and see how much they elected to give characters like, say, Caroline. So Caroline got to sing at least twice on the show. I do love Candace's singing voice. Like, I love Caroline. If you're new here, I love Caroline. It's not a surprise. But it always grinds my gears that Bonnie didn't receive that same opportunity. And you see that throughout the show.
Yeah.
Caroline gets to sing 3 times. Bonnie doesn't get to sing anytime, even though we all know that Kat's a very talented singer and dancer. Caroline gets, I don't even know how many love interests. Bonnie gets maybe like 3 over the course of the show.
So it's Jeremy. She had that brief thing with a guy, the witch guy.
Yeah.
Enzo.
And Enzo, yeah.
Is there literally anybody else?
I believe that's it. And none of them were even really that developed. Sorry if you ship Bonnie and Jeremy, but that ship was weird.
He wasn't even fully in it for part of that ship. He was still in love with Anna, and even before Vicky, Anna, it was Vicky.
Fighting over Anna. Yeah. So
and she
not
just
exactly...
had to, like, settle. It was
It
so
was very
weird.
bizarre. It's weird because even when they say lines like, but you're my best friend's brother, it's like the characters are self-aware. Like they know this is weird, but then they're
like,
just
this
kind of
was
going with
forced
it
on
anyways.
us.
The word that kept coming to my mind when you were talking about how her story is shaped by Elena's and molds itself to Elena's, all the things that she goes through, she defers to her, is like the word that I kept thinking of. Elena comes first in everything. So if she loses her grandmother because of Elena inadvertently, then she can't be so angry at Elena because that's her best friend. She loses so many people throughout the show, including Enzo, in case you missed it. There's this one sequence in season 8 where I believe Caroline and Stefan had just gotten engaged, and Bonnie snaps at her and tells her, I am jealous of looking at you and Stefan with you and your kids, and you're so happy. Content warning. She alludes to being suicidal over it, just how lonely she is, because at this point, I believe Enzo and Damon are off doing whatever it is they're doing with Sybil, this evil lady. I don't remember season 8, guys. I just remember how mad it made me. It's just so telling that that's where her character ends in the final season of the whole show. There wasn't
literally
really
not
much
even allowed
growth.
to be happy.
Yeah, like the growth that she does experience, I think, is more in terms of her powers and maybe how she comes out of her shell. But there really isn't a lot of screen time, even though she's supposedly one of the 3 best friends.
When we were watching last, we're in the middle of season 5, or kind of near the beginning of season 5. And the whole process of her sacrificing herself for Jeremy to bring him back was really weird. And
yes,
as a character, I don't feel like Bonnie is given enough room in canon to explore her emotions the way that even Elena is. And I said Elena doesn't have enough room for that. So, like, it's even less space for her to go through that. Even when she's mad at Elena and not talking to her and giving herself space to deal with what she's going through. So first of all, she has to deal with that off screen. They just don't give her any time on the screen.
Yeah.
And then they bring her in and she has to stop worrying about it. I wouldn't say it's unreasonable to think that she's also suicidal by the end, because she goes through a lot and she doesn't really get the ability to work through it. But it's still disappointing because you want to see her have literally any support, and it's just so flimsy. She literally died to save this guy that she loved, and it was like nobody knew. Like nobody noticed.
Yeah, so she
was just like, it's fine.
Yeah, so she died. I'm pretty sure that she doesn't really come back until maybe season 6, and by then it's like halfway through the season.
So that's a lie. We've made it a little further into season 5, and Bonnie is definitely alive. It's just that she's the anchor.
I'm not ready. I don't want this.
Bonnie, what's going on?
One would argue that somehow that is infinitely worse than simply just being dead.
They put her through the ringer throughout the whole show with nothing to show for it.
She is, like you said, one of the main 3, and at a certain point, Elena was no longer going to be in the show. Okay? So then you say, who's your new main character? At that point, it fully should have been Bonnie, because Caroline and Stefan kind of already had their thing going.
Yeah.
And so you needed Bonnie to be lifted up to that space because she now had the room for it. And instead of giving her that full room to be the main character, they didn't give her any conclusion that really fit her. And I feel like as far as her love interest, doing something that felt organic the way Caroline felt organic, or even Tyler and Caroline felt organic, they should have done that with Damon. But because the writers are the writers, they insisted otherwise, and she was stuck not just with Jeremy, but with Enzo too, who felt like just handoffs.
She should have been elevated to main character status, obviously way before, but especially in season 7, because her entire life was tethered to Elena's. Like, that was the whole thing. So if Elena was her main character and her entire life force is tethered to this other character who is powerful, who's dynamic. The fans love her already. Why not give the space? Instead, I remember the earliest parts of season 7, she's on a trip with Damon and Alaric to make sure neither of them go off the rails. So she's literally there as a support. So that's it. That's like the first time we see her in the first episode of season 7. So yeah, there's just a lot that they could have handled better with Bonnie, but because of racism and sexism, they didn't do that. And to speak to your point about Damon, he was the one character that she had significant chemistry with.
Yeah.
And they just decided that fans really loved Elena.
Did they?
The thing is, there was a good portion of us who really loved Bonnie and Damon. So again, the writers had their bias, and they didn't even do it effectively, which is why fan fiction's really important. One of the more significant fandom memories I have growing up was walking home from school with my friend Miriam, and she and I would stop under a tree near her house, and we would just talk for hours. I'm not even kidding, for hours about Bonnie and Damon.
Literal hours.
Yeah. She had this whole elaborate story about Damon and a brown character, because Miriam is Indian and I am Filipina, and so we would self-insert like characters who looked like us in whatever pieces of media that we could. So we would do that with TBD. We did that with Supernatural as well, and that's how we kind of dealt with the lack of representation. Bonnie symbolized so much for both of us because, in case you missed it, there's not a lot of people with melanin in Mystic Falls. Still to this day, even as we rewatch the show, I'll point it out. I'll be like, oh my god, there's an Asian person in the background. Oh my goodness, there's the one Asian student. That just reminded me of how Hayley Kiyoko had like one episode and then she was killed off. Oh, that still pisses me off. Yeah, so fan fiction. Miriam and I would run wild with abandon in terms of headcanons. And I remember when Elena left the show, we were like, surely season 7 is going to be all about Stereline and Damon. Because that's the direction.
It felt natural.
Yeah, that's the direction we all thought it would go, because that's how they were building it up to be. And they just kind of backtracked. I remember at the time the writers were announcing things like, oh, they have a meaningful friendship. But they were being vague before about the relationship between Bonnie and Damon. And then towards the end of the season or whatever, it was just like, no, actually she's with Enzo. So I don't know if somebody tried in the writer's room to do justice to those characters, and then the writers, who we will not name, decided that that's just not the way that the cookie crumbles.
Neither of us have the experience of what it's like being in the writer's room for a TV show like this. However, as a fan, and it's a very specific feeling to be in a fandom and engage in fandom, that's not just enjoying a piece of media, that's engaging in a community that surrounds it. And that's where fan fiction is so strong, because you are creating alternate timelines, alternate worlds, or just scenes or instances where things are better than what canon has provided. And that's okay that canon sucks sometimes, but when you have something that's so persistent, it really ruins the media.
Yeah.
And you can still love something and be frustrated that it's doing a certain thing. So in this case, we had a lot of fun watching the Vampire Diaries and engaging with the world and the characters. But at a certain point, you can only pull away from canon so much to make it palatable. Fan fiction does that, but you get to a point where you're living in a completely headcanon world because that's all you can do, because the writers hate their own characters that much.
Right, yeah.
I just feel like Bonnie's one of those characters that the writers, it feels like the writers didn't even want her there. Which is so weird to say, because obviously it's their character and their story and they're writing it. But I'm like, how do you hate your character that much that everything you do is a disservice to them? Not for the story and not for their character direction, but just for no discernible reason.
It's just deplorable, though, how
it's weird.
You sacrifice so much good for that because of your own biases. So reading specifically Bonnie fanfiction can be really healing, because then you're seeing all of, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? So you're seeing what could have been, and then you can let it make you bitter, as it did me for a while. But now it makes me more appreciative of stories, whether or not they're fan fiction, that are put out there by women of color, by Black women, that feature characters that look like themselves, and they don't hold back. So one of my favorite Bonnie fan fictions, which is still ongoing, is called You Know I Will Adore You Till Eternity. You know it's good when part of the title is in brackets. It's been going on since like 2014, so basically since season 6. It revolves around Bonnie and Damon, because of course it does, with a side of Stereline. And the author has handled the characterization so much more effectively, because that's another thing I wanted to maybe touch on, is that fan fiction can sort of fill the gaps of characterization, and whether or not it's consistent. So they have more consistent characterization. In this case, they had a more enticing plot line, and they gave more time for Bonnie and Damon both to develop as characters individually and together as like a couple. It's just more satisfying that way. Granted, fan fiction obviously is a narrative story, so it's not
it's a different medium. It's also often usually character focused, and the TV show won't always be, because it has to have an overarching plot.
Right,
but I do like Fix a lot for that reason, because they often take a moment in the show and turn it so that it feels more consistent or feels more authentic, where the writers maybe missed the ball. And, that just kind of happened. I thought about the Avengers, for example, and how we used fan fiction to really give substance to what was lacking in the movies, which made the experience overall more enjoyable to a point. So you're engaging with the fandom and with the media in this way that feels better. You mentioned that fan fiction, you get to see and celebrate the works of smaller writers who don't have the opportunity to be in the writer's room for a big TV show.
Right.
Which is great too.
Yeah, and I know a counterpoint to the argument that, you can support other creators is, well, why don't you just support the creators that are already doing it in the mainstream?
Unfortunately,
I didn't grow up. I didn't grow up knowing many writers that were doing that. That wasn't a thing that I was aware was an option when I was growing up. But what fanfiction did allowed me to understand that this was a path that writers like me could take. That made me more, I think, aware of the fact that there was a lack of representation across the board. This is like a little excerpt from my fan fiction essay that I wrote towards the end of my degree earlier this year. I will be posting this because, spoiler alert, we're going to be doing a blog soon. All you can feel the blog. One of the first posts that we're going to do is in defense of fan fiction essay that I wrote. So here we go. In canon, or in the show, Bonnie Bennett has historically been sidelined to further a white character's plot, and she has often been cited in conversations about representation. Many works, like the fic I mentioned earlier, exist to provide the character the joy her white counterparts received by the series' end and the joy she was barred from. So, You Know I Will Adore You is a concrete example of how effective fanfiction can, for some, even transcend the aesthetic value of its source material. So fanfiction is accessible, and it teaches readers to engage with media in a critical and non-restrictive way. And until my friends and I engaged in fandom, I only ever wrote narratives that centered white characters and perspectives. It was all I knew, save for a few Asian American stories here or there. Recently, I pointed out that one of my first encounters with an Asian American character was Yoko from Timothy Goes to School. The cartoon cat. Yeah. So fanfiction has underscored for me the significance of characters and consistent characterization, as well as what characters can signify for many across cultures and intersections, which has allowed me to be more thoughtful about my own original characters. So as a writer, it's important for me to understand what hits in a story. And like you said, many fan fictions are based on characters and relationships. And that's really the main thread that tugs at people's hearts in the first place. Mm-hmm. There you have it, guys. Fanfiction matters. And fanfiction, especially about Bonnie Bennett, matters.
Also, sometimes it's okay to say that canon sucks.
Yes.
You don't have to be like, I mean, it's what the writers wrote and that's what they decided and so it's good. No, sometimes they don't know what they're doing, and that's okay. There are some shows you look at the writer credits and you're like, it's that writer, I see. Like, you just know there's a lot of different people writing it. There's bound to be inconsistencies. And sometimes it's bigger than that. Sometimes it's that racism, you know? Sometimes it's a bigger issue. And it's absolutely appropriate to call them out on it.
Yeah, a lot of us have this when we're growing up idea of authors and writers as these entities that have wonderful insight into the world, and so we shouldn't disrespect their craft or their art by like criticizing. But this isn't criticizing, guys. Like, this is critiquing, and critiquing is in fact trying to elevate the piece, and therefore is trying to inform the artist how to do their craft better. That's not an insult. The fact that we want to help improve it by talking about it in a critical way shows that we have investment in it, shows that therefore we find value in at least some of what they write. We need to be more okay with saying canon sucks. So in conclusion, we stand Bonnie Bennett. Often we end these things with, go watch whatever piece of media that we just talked about. But
go read some fan fiction.
Tasteless thing to do. Yeah, go read some fan fiction. We'll link some below in the description too. And if you have a favorite fan fiction, it doesn't have to be for Bonnie Bennett, but have you ever been betrayed by canon? You probably have.
Betrayed
and have
by
you
canon.
Ever turned in response for comfort towards Archive of Our Own, fanfiction.net, live journal? Comment below. We want to hear just how salty you might have been. All right, so without further ado, that brings us to the end of our episode. Go read fanfiction, go wreak havoc,
and have a witchy week.
Have a witchy week, guys.